Since I am the only thing standing between us and a cocktail, I thought I'd open with a question that's really ideal to ask when you've got a drink in your hand, and I mean this seriously. This is a great question at a dinner party when the wine has started to flow, right? If you really want to have a big swirly discussion with your dinner party guests, ask them what they think have been the most important developments in human history. And it helps if you time bound it a little bit, because people start talking about, migrating out of Africa and going around the globe. So if you put a 4,000-year bound on it and try to get your people to concentrate, you start to hear fascinating answers to this question, because the philosophers pipe up pretty quickly, and they talk about systems of thought in both the West and the East that profoundly changed how people think about the world. And then the theologists will speak up and say, no, actually, the biggest developments in the history of the world have been the stories of the founding of the world's major religions. That is what has changed the way people live their lives, how they think about the world and their place in it. And then you get some more truculent people to answer, and they say, no, the big stories in the history of the world are the stories of war and conquest and empire, and that has actually what's changed the way people live their lives, who they come in contact with, and what their lives look like. And then you get some cheery souls, usually biologists, who say, don't forget about the plagues. And this is what's really moved the world, this is what we die from. You do get some kind of happier or more optimistic answers to this question. People will talk about the opening up of the world via exploration. They'll talk about huge intellectual achievements like the inventions of zero and calculus and the discipline of mathematics. And you'll get the artsy types who talk about periods when the arts really expanded and flourished in different parts of the world. This conversation will go on as long as the wine lasts. And it typically doesn't converge, because people just yell at each other. The philosophers yell at the theologians, who yell at the warlike people, and the biologist keeps talking about plagues. And you don't come to any closure on this question. And it's probably an impossible question to answer. But if you were smart enough to invite a couple geeks to your dinner party, and I think most of us here probably know a couple of geeks, if you are smart enough to have invited a couple of geeks to your dinner party, they will have what I think is a really productive take on this question, because they'll start by asking the classic geek question, which is, well, what do the data say? And this is not how most of us are used to thinking about it, but geeks take an inherently empirical approach to questions like this, and they'll say, well, is there data about human history? And if so, what story does it tell? In other words, can we turn this timeline of human history into a graph? And stop looking at the back of my bald head. No, we can't. I'm going to have to fake. I'm going to draw two axes. I'm going to be faking. Oh, here we go. They'll say, look, can we turn this timeline into a graph, and can we draw human history somehow? It turns out you can, because we have been able to chart numbers of interest, like the number of people in the world. And there's been some lovely work by guys like Ian Morris, who have tried to chart human social development over time. How advanced are our societies? So we have these data series that go back a long way about human history. And the geeks say, great, let's draw the curves, because one good way to think about the question of the most important developments in human history are those developments that have bent the curve most. It's a great way to think about the question. Not the only one, but a really valid way to think about it. When you do that, when you take the geek approach here, you realize a couple fairly surprising, to my eyes, really astonishing things. The first thing you realize is that none of these things have mattered at all. It doesn't matter whether you're charting human population or social development, those curves are exactly the same, and they flatline throughout all this time period that we're talking about. These are little trivial blips. The founding of the world's great religions, wars, empires, plagues, famines, exploits, none of it seems to matter much at all. And then you notice that at one point in time, this curve takes about a 90-degree bend, and it goes from boring horizontal to holy Toledo vertical. It happens in a chronological blink of an eye, And it's pretty clear that something happened around that time that bent the curve of human history like nothing else that we've ever come across. Two-word answer to what it was. Shout it out when you know it. Good. There are two possible two-word answers. One is Industrial Revolution. The other is steam engine. Equal credit for both. But literally, what bent the curve of human history, demonstrably, what bent the curve of human history is when we overcame the limitations of our muscles and our animals' muscles and trivial water power, and we accelerated our ability to take energy from the environment. The story of human history, what bent the curve, is the story of the first machine age, when we built machines that would let us harness power and overcome the limitations of our muscles. I hope it's pretty clear why I'm telling this story. It's not to give us a late-in-the-day history lesson. What we're doing now, I mean this in all seriousness, what we're doing now is overcoming the limitations of our individual minds to at least the same extent that we overcame the limitations of our muscles with the first machine age. So we are, to my eyes, somewhere in the early stages of a second machine age. We have internetworked, powerful personal computers for, at the outside, the most generous estimate, 20 years. And when we think about putting these computers into the hands of everybody on the planet and interconnecting them, what are we, 5, 10 years into that journey at the outside? So I honestly believe we are in the early phases of this second machine age, and what we are going to see, probably not along the same dimensions. I hope our human population doesn't just keep going like this. That needs to level off. But along other dimensions of human progress and betterment, we are going to see things that are going to bend the curve, I believe, to at least as big an extent as we saw during the first machine age. So what I'd like to do in just the last few minutes here is talk about what we're seeing and what we're learning so far, what my colleagues and I at MIT are seeing and learning and concluding about this new machine age, particularly for enterprises. And I want to talk about a few findings from a very unevenly distributed future. One of my favorite quotes is from William Gibson, the science fiction author, who says, "The future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed." So one of the fun things that we get to do is look around where the future is most advanced and then think about what that's going to mean going forward. I want to talk about 4 different things that we're concluding from a very unevenly distributed future. And to tee that up, I want to put up a great essay that Mark Andreessen, legendary inventor and venture capitalist, wrote in the Wall Street Journal just a couple years ago, where he said software is eating the world. And his message to the rest of the economy was essentially, I'm investing in companies that are going to come after you. And with software, we are going to eat the world, one industry, one sector at a time. It's a bold claim. It's not entirely without merit. And so I want to take this idea of software, morph it a little bit, use another word instead, and talk about 4 things that I've seen going on that I find incredibly interesting and good indicators of what's to come. And instead of software, I want to use the word code here and use those as our letters to talk about the 4 things. The first one is, keeping in with our science fiction theme, the organizations that we're going to build are going to be different kinds of cyborg. And by that, I mean combinations of people and machines that we really have not seen before and that are going to seem very strange in science fiction to us. My favorite example of this so far is an industrial robot that looks about as different from current industrial robots as it's possible to imagine. This is me and my co-author, Eric Brynjolfsson, hanging out with Baxter. Baxter is an industrial robot built by Rethink Robotics here in town, founded by legendary MIT roboticist Rodney Brooks there, the guy that brought us the Roomba. He's now bringing us a new generation of industrial robot. Baxter costs about $22,000, not millions. You unpack him from his crate, you plug him into the normal electrical system on the wall, you train his 2 arms there, you don't program anything, you grab him by the hands and tell him what you want him to do. And then after about a half hour of training, he can get a day's work done in your facility. What they're learning so far is that when you put Baxter on a conveyor belt or an assembly line, he starts to become part of the team with the people there. And when Rodney and his colleagues have come back a little while later, they see Baxter wearing T-shirts with baseball hats on. And he's just really, I think he pitches for the softball team. He's become part of the team on a shop floor there. So we're combining human and digital labor in ways that we have not been able to do before. And even in some of the most automated and advanced areas of the economy, like internet search these days, we still find that human beings have an important role to play. This is the encouraging news for us. There's a lot of challenging news in the labor force these days. The stuff that I take heart from is that even when the sector is incredibly digital and incredibly automated, we still need some human smarts involved. So we're building cyborg organizations, and we don't know exactly how they're going to look. I'm confident they're going to look really different than a lot of the ones we have right now. Our organizations are also going to become a huge amount more open. At least the successful ones will. Two of my favorite other quotes about this age that we're building, one from Bill Joy, one of the co-founders of Sun Microsystems. He laid down a law. Joy's law says that the smartest people work for somebody else. He said that at Sun, which was full of extremely smart people. Eric Raymond, the open source software advocate, says, with enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. And what we're seeing companies do now is take advantage or internalize both of those things, take their challenges, take their really tough problems, open them up to the outside world, put as many eyeballs on them as possible. And it really doesn't matter if you're thinking about your coding challenges or your data challenges or your innovation challenges or your product challenges. There is a platform, there's a startup, there's a resource out there you can use to become more open and try to internalize Joy's law. All of us by now have our favorite big data story. It's incredibly clear that the successful organizations of the future are going to be a lot more data-driven even than they are today, and that this rigorous analytical approach is permeating the economy. The one example I want to give is some work that I did with my colleagues Dan Snow and Lamar Pierce. We tried to document what happens in about the farthest sector away from the data-intensive Facebook or Google, Silicon Valley that I can think of. We tried to look at what big data means if you're the first frontline manager at a chain restaurant somewhere in the country. Because what happens now is in these restaurants, you've got POS systems that track everything that happens server by server, bartender by bartender, location by location, at an incredibly low level of detail. And one of the vendors of these systems realized a while back that you can apply some analysis to this mass of extremely low-level transactional data and use it to figure out, for example, which of your employees are probably stealing from you. And if any of us have worked in a restaurant environment or tried to run one, you know that's one of the biggest problems that you face. So this company took a very clever approach. They said, we're going to make our best guesses about some questionable behavior down at the individual level. But instead of giving the manager a list of who they should go fire tomorrow, we're just going to give them reports by person with the total dollar value of suspicious transactions going on. And we're just going to let them distribute those around to people. You don't need to yell and scream. You don't need to fire anybody. You just need to let people know that there's a whole nother level of monitoring and visibility about what's going on possible because of data these days. So Lamar, Dan, and I were able to watch what happens to the performance, the operational performance in these restaurants before and after these systems go live. When, for the very first time, you have this data-driven visibility over the bad behavior that might be going on. The findings are kind of shocking to me. That red line is when the system went live. And what we're graphing here is weekly revenue by chain. You see how it took kind of a different trajectory? We get the strong impression people are cleaning up their act a little bit when they realize that there's some new visibility going on. Let me show you a graph that I find even more astonishing than this. This is what tip percentage looks like before and after. So what appears to be happening is that the servers are stealing less and working a little bit harder to take good care of their customers. That makes everybody happier. Their customers walk away happier, they're giving bigger tips, the restaurant makes more money, and hopefully the server is doing the right thing instead of being devious and doing the wrong thing. So with this very data-forward, data-driven approach, we are witnessing how I think no sector of the economy is going to remain untouched here. And then finally, the E in code, what I mean by evolving here is how quickly innovation is happening, business models are changing, disruption is occurring industry by industry. And we could give countless examples here. One I want to give is the rental car business, which got started pretty quickly after World War II. Avis was founded in 1946. And for a while, this was a fairly stable industry with a set of players who took market share from each other. Avis tried harder, so they did pretty well. And innovation here meant something like the guy had a computer that he could check you out with, which was great. The convenience increased here. Then in 2000, some people here in town said, why don't we think about rental cars a different way? And why don't we try to sprinkle rental cars available all over a city? And when you want one, we're going to give you a card that will let you walk up to it, unlock it, and drive it away. You bring it back when you're done. There's no check-in, there's no check-out, there's no human involved anywhere in that. Nowadays, I can reserve it, unlock it, drive away from it using my phone. So starting in 2000, Zipcar really started to shake up the car rental market, to the point they just got bought by Avis, actually. But then even more recently, 10 years after that, another group of innovators came along and said, you know what? Why don't we rent cars to each other? Most cars sit in people's driveways not being driven most of the time. That's an asset that could be put to much more productive use. So starting 3 years ago, Relay Rides came around and said, no, we're just going to enable peer-to-peer car renting here. So the industry really started to get shaken up. The latest incarnation here is one that still has me freaking out a little bit. Starting in just last year, starting in 2012, a service called Lyft started up, where you use your smartphone to call a car to come to you. It's a car owned by another private individual. They drive up, they take you where you want to go. I think when you get into the car, you're literally supposed to fist bump the person. That's how you, I'm not making that up. That's how you know you're doing the right thing. When you get out, your smartphone application says, to avoid the taxi regulation, hey, would you like to give that person who just gave you a ride a donation? And you say, yeah, I'd love to, thanks very much. I guess if you don't want to, you don't have to, but this is how this whole thing is supposed to work. Peer-to-peer, donation-based, fist-bumping car service. When the car drives up, the reason you know it's the car that you're supposed to hop into, there's a pink mustache attached to the front of it. I am not making these things up, but I can imagine people who have been in the car rental industry for a while looking at each other and going, huh? Like this does not make any sense to us anymore. This pace of change and legitimate disruption and innovation is getting faster all the time. This is great news. I want to end with just two conclusions. What are going to be the results of all of this? The first one that I can predict with a lot of confidence is a huge amount more turbulence in the business world. And the last time we saw a change this big was when the manufacturing industries electrified just about a century ago. And there was a really interesting pattern. The big industrial trusts that were on top of these industries, these manufacturing industries, in 1905 were not the same ones who were on top of the industries 30 years later. Only in about a third of the cases did the incumbents successfully navigate the shift. And in the other 2/3 of the cases, they went out of business, they limped along, they got bought or sold, but there was a new crop of leaders in these industries, big industries with entrenched leaders. Over the space of about a generation, there was a big disruption that took place. As I look ahead at the second machine age, it's pretty clear to me that very few sectors of the economy are going to remain unaffected, and we're going to see, I believe, pretty parallel levels of disruption going on country after country, sector after sector. So this is worrying if you're an incumbent in an industry these days, but when I think about my life as a consumer or a member of society, I just get incredibly optimistic about the world that we're creating. I think that this quote from the physicist Freeman Dyson is actually not hype, it's not hyperbole. It's actually an accurate statement about where we are. Technology is what makes our lives better and what changes, I mean this literally, changes the arc of human history. We're changing it again. And some of us get nostalgic about the good old days. I think that is the worst pose, the most short-sighted, ignorant pose you could possibly take. So the last quote I'm going to put up, and I think a good one to head into happy hour on, is from an old Roman poet, actually. He said, "Let others praise ancient times. I'm glad I was born in these." Thanks very much.
Andy McAfee, folks.